maybe blankly. But which of these two trees, are 7 phylogenetic trees up here, which ones are unlike the other 5? There are a couple of differences. Small ones. Yes. So which tree?
G.
G. Okay, so what's different about G than all the rest of the trees? Right, there's one node where 3 branches come off of it. We're used to seeing branches split. One branch becomes 2, one branch becomes 2, one branch becomes 2. So it's at that node, we have a 3-way split. It's like there was one population existing at that point in time that broke into 3 separate lineages. That's what's called a polytomy. Tome means to cut, poly means many, so it's like one branch gets cut into many pieces, splits into many branches. Polytomy. None of the other trees have a polytomy, so that rules that tree out. Everywhere else, one branch splits into 2 as time progresses. Which direction is time going in all of these trees?
It's descending. Or
Where's the past, the bottom or the top? Past is at the root. Moving to present, where all the branch tips are. So all the branch tips represent some sort of currently existing organisms. Species, genera, taxa, kingdoms, phyla, something. So which is the other one that is unlike the other 5? Okay, so I got votes for D. So what is it about D that you find different?
An extra budding branch off of one of the already present ones. So one of them splits into 2 and then another one splits into 2, whereas the others are generally connected to the same foundation.
So another way to answer that is there are 2 pairs of sister taxa in this tree. Whereas in the rest, there was just one group that shared a most recent common ancestor. So today is all about practicing phylogenies some more, interpreting them, reading them, drawing them, understanding. Do we have any questions about material last class? Any outstanding issues at this point? The last class, we started talking about phylogenetics. We had some vocabulary, we did some tree analysis. One of the things I asked was to take one of these 4 phylogenetic trees and redraw them with frogs or turtles on top or on bottom. So here's one of the submissions from one of you. Is this accurate? Is this tree that's drawn on the left showing us the same evolutionary relationships as the trees on the right? So, yeah, where in every one of the trees, 4 trees on the right, what is fish? It's the outgroup, the most distantly related organism. So over here, in these trees, fish are always the species or group of species. We have to go farthest back in time before we find the ancestral population from which all of these vertebrates derived. So they're always going to be the branch that branches off first. In any tree you draw, if it's going to be the same, it's going to have the same relationships. So fish should branch off closest to the root of the tree. How are we doing now? We've got fish branch first, frogs branch second, does everything else seem consistent between what's drawn on the right and the trees on the left? The common ancestor of mammals, birds, crocodiles, and turtles. Birds and crocodiles share the most recent common ancestor.
To me, it looks very similar to D.
Now it is. So by moving fish, I've made this submission turn into tree D. Well spotted. So how are we going to put frogs on top? Fish are always going to be the outgroup. So we'd have to flip that entire part of the tree upside down. So that, in other words, that would look like fish still is the outgroup. Frogs are going to be down at the bottom. So that's, in other words, that's the first branch. Fish separating from the outgroup. Okay, so what branches next? We got fish and frogs. So we need to have the clade with the other 4 species. So you could put mammals there. You could have turtles, birds, and this is just one example. There are a lot of ways to do this. So does what I've drawn in the upper right-hand corner have the same topology, structure of branches, as the rest? We have birds and crocodiles being the most closely related taxa. Then they share a common ancestor with turtles, then with mammals, then with frogs, then with fish. So all that was taking this whole bit of the tree, flipping it upside down essentially, and then rewriting. Put frogs on the bottom. So now, which is the most evolved organism in the tree I drew in the upper right? None. Careful. So nobody's more evolved than anybody else. Why is it? None. Why are none more evolved? Because they're all existing species. So they've all evolved to this point in time. So it depends on how you want to define evolved. And as we discussed last class, it's kind of a subjective term. When you talk about who's more evolved than somebody else, does that mean you're talking about they've got more senses, more cells? Who's more complex?
So are you referring to mammals, birds, crocodiles, and turtles?
All of them. So fish exist presently, frogs exist presently, turtles exist somewhere in the world, not in here. Mammals, birds, and crocodiles. It's sort of human-centric to think that we're most evolved, and that's often a view that's espoused. But all these creatures exist today, so they've adapted to their environments. They are evolved. So I'm just urging everybody to drop the concept of degrees of evolvedness. We exist, we've evolved. So one more example, student submissions. How does this work for you? Which of the 4 phylogenies on the right does this one look most like? frogs. So the first three, what I'm looking at, there's no right answer to this. I'm just asking you to evaluate the trees. What I see is that the structure of that part of the tree is the same as that tree. Fish branch first, then frogs, then mammals. It's true of all the trees. It's just that these are done in the same order. C looks very much like that part of the tree that was submitted. So how does the rest of the tree differ? Is it different? What has this student done to create the blue tree on the left?
The node at the bottom, like flipped it.
Right. They took that whole part, flipped it upside down. Then you get, so in this case, birds from top to bottom are 1, 2, and 3. Here the order is upside down. So it's exactly the same tree. It shows exactly the same evolutionary relationships between all of these species. Right? Birds and crocodiles still have the most recent common ancestor. They split most recently in time in both of those trees. C, A, B, D, and this fifth tree. Call it E. But now turtles is simply drawn on the bottom of the tree, not somewhere in the middle. And presumably, if I gave this to you on an exam, although now that you know about this, maybe you wouldn't answer the same way. Presumably, if I had given this on an exam, a lot of you would have said turtles are the most evolved species. Because as we showed in the poll that I took over the weekend, it tended to be the species that were either on the left or the right or the top or the bottom of the tree, where most students assumed that that meant that they were the most evolved. So this was an example of a well-crafted response to the question. Yeah?
So in this example, who's the most evolved, or is it still none?
Still none. So there's never any most evolved organism. That was, the question I asked on that poll was a trick question.
Is that because these phylogenies are so simple? If we had something that was larger?
So a word that we tend to use is not more evolved. This gets into some tricky areas of evolution, not that we're not already there, is derived. So there's a term called a derived species or derived trait, meaning most of the species we look at have one trait, but one species or group of species differs. So let's say birds. What's a trait that birds share that most of the other species on this tree don't share? Flight. So we talked about that briefly last class. So we might say, we know that there's mammals, there's bats that fly as well. But on this tree, this is a good example. So in this case, flight is what we'd call a derived, VED, trait. Which means that it wasn't in the ancestor. That was a trait that showed up during the evolution of what are now modern birds. So most of the species don't have it, but one of the taxa or a few of the taxa have it. That would be a derived trait. And that's where we get into a little bit of the gray area. Doesn't that mean that they're more evolved? Not more evolved, they're just differently evolved. They have a trait that nobody else has. So a relatively new trait, a derived trait, a trait that's not ancestral. So if we went, in other words, to restate it one more way, the way that an evolutionary biologist would interpret this tree is that the ancestor was not a flying ancestor. So the root of the tree, if we went back in time, we looked at whatever organisms were living then, they weren't flying. Can anybody make an argument for why that would be the case? I mean, why do I assert that based on this phylogenetic tree?
Because there wasn't more branching to depict that derived trait.
Let's see. So, branching. What other branches don't have flight, or do have flight up here? So there's one tiny little branch. There's one species of mammal, or several probably, but There are bats. Okay, so we've got bats, we've got birds. Anything else up here? Are there any species we could add up here that fly? Birds, bats.
What about those flying fish?
Well, on the tree. Okay, so there's flying fish. Thank you very much.
Am I making it more complicated?
You're making it more complicated. No, that's actually fine. They don't technically fly because they don't have wings, but we'll add flying fish. So there are a few fish that know how to jump out of the water and use their pectoral fins to soar. Good for them. Look at all the cool movies on YouTube of flying fish. So we've got mammals, birds, and fish that fly. So let's say that's one species. I don't honestly know. So let's say one species of flying fish. We've got a handful of species of mammals. I don't know how many species of bats exist, so I'm going to say 10, just for example. And then we've got birds, all of which fly, except for the few that have lost that trait. The dodo. Why does this argue that the ancestor did not fly? So this is the real root of interpreting phylogenetic trees. We have like 1,000 species that fly, one fish, say 10 mammals that are all closely related to each other because they're all bats, and then a whole huge group of species called birds. So flight is not found in any of the other taxa. So how many species of frogs, mammals, crocodiles, turtles, and fish exist that don't fly? Thousands, tens of thousands, all together. So the overwhelming evidence is it more likely that our ancestor, the root down here, was a flying organism, and those thousands and tens of thousands of species of fish, frogs, mammals, etc., all lost the ability to fly? Or is it more likely that the common ancestor wasn't a flying organism and that flight evolved separately in one species of fish, bats, and one group called birds? Right. So these are derived, that's why we argue that these are derived traits. There are very few, relative to all of the species that could be on this tree, there are very few of them that fly. It's more likely, by chance, that those few evolved flight separately rather than so many species lost the ability to fly if the common ancestor had started with that trait.
And isn't it true that, like, according to parsimony, you want, like, the least amount of evolutionary change?
So this is the concept of parsimony. Some of you might also be familiar with the concept of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the most likely explanation. It's a philosophical argument. So this is the concept of parsimony, which suggests that the fewest changes is the most likely explanation for how evolution happened.
Could you explain how the derived trait fits into this one more time?
So that's parsimony. So derived trait. So a derived trait is one that was not present in an ancestor. It's one that recently evolved, and usually one that's not shared by most of the organisms that are shown on the phylogeny. So, in other words, derived traits represent evolutionary novelties. Something new shows up. New trait, flight, the eyeball, thumbs, opposable thumbs, that is, one that makes us special. Thanks all of you also who participated in this exercise. Draw or write a hypothesis of how these populations related to each other. Here are some of the submissions. I'm not going to go through all of them necessarily, but we have different hypotheses. So the key point here is to underscore something that was in the chapter reading. And Stephen asked a great question yesterday about this. He said, well, do you want a written hypothesis or do you want a drawn hypothesis? So about half of you turned in written hypotheses on Google Classroom, and some of you turned in drawn hypotheses. This is the point. A phylogeny is a hypothesis. So all of these trees are hypotheses about how these organisms are related to each other. So subconsciously, when I wrote that assignment, I was expecting drawn responses, not written. It's fine if you wrote. Those are hypotheses too. But phylogenies are hypotheses. Right? When you see a phylogenetic tree, you should never take it as fact. Why is that? That's exactly right. There's evidence. We base phylogenetic trees on data, but there is never going to be any proof that this is exactly what happened as evolution unfolded, because we can't go back in time. So the best we can do is create hypotheses. Those are the trees, and then we can test them with data that we collect and find out which of these is most likely given the evidence that we have. There's a philosophical standpoint. The phylogenetic tree is never fact. It can be supported by data and be the most likely hypothesis. So up here, let's see. I'm just trying to interpret, so how did students likely come up with these phylogenetic trees? So we've got a common ancestor in this one in the upper left. The root. What's true of all of these organisms that I just circled? Okay, so these are all one species. This is representing the concept, again, vocabulary from the textbook. This is sometimes colloquially called a clade. Another term for this, a clade is a group of organisms. It's any group. So it's a very generic term. You can use it for, in this case, the French and the Papuan form a clade. The French, Papuan, and Han you could also refer to as a clade. So what's common among all of these groups I'm calling clades.
From one species?
They all, in this case actually, it's that they all derive from one common ancestor. So the other term that's used in the textbook, which we'll use also, is monophyletic. Or monophyly, means derived from one common ancestor. So all of the taxa that evolved or derived from one common ancestor form a monophyletic group. So the tree in the bottom left, where's the monophyletic group? So all of the humans, so this is, what did we call this on the first slide? This point right here? So it's a clade, but when one branch splits into multiple branches at the same point in time. Polytomy. Yeah, these do represent then multiple sister taxa. So can you envision, maybe, what this means for human evolution, if this hypothesis is correct? You've got one group, at this point in time, the blue dot, common ancestor of all current human populations. What happened? We were all living in one place on the earth, it doesn't matter where. It's like one population of humans did what? They just said, we're gonna do this. You go to that continent, you go to that continent, you go to that continent. We just split at the same point in time, humans spread all over the earth. That's what a polytomy would represent. It's one thing a polytomy would represent. Like at one point in time, a bunch of groups of humans go off in different directions and evolve different traits. So that now we recognize the French as the French, and the San as the San, and the Yoruba as the Yoruba, and so forth. So that's one clade. There's another clade on here. Right. So any questions about these responses, phylogenies, concerns, clarifications?
Does the top one imply that
French that Poo and San and Yoruba are different species?
So do any of these trees make any claims or representations about who is part of one species or another? Can you infer, based on these trees, where species boundaries exist, where one species becomes a different species? The bottom left?
yeah, the bottom right?
Bottom right.
The common chimp.
Okay, so the one on the bottom right's got an interesting twist. Which I don't know if we want to be politically correct or not. So we've got Asian and European populations sharing a common ancestor with chimps. But then you have to go farther back in time. So we know that these are Homo sapiens, Han and French, as are the Papuan, Yoruba, and San populations. Right? Hopefully everybody agrees. We're being both scientifically accurate and politically correct. All of these groups are Homo sapiens. So what this suggests is that the common chimp, a different species, how does it find itself wedged in between the relationships of a bunch of members of the same species? And that's why
Did the writing go with?
these other trees all have bonobos and chimpanzees, non-human primates, being either more closely related to each other or more closely related to the common ancestor of all of these individuals. Yeah,
Did the writing go with that tree? Or
the
is
writing went with that tree.
I don't know if the writing matches what the tree is saying.
Right. That's possible that the writing doesn't match what the tree says. But the tree, so they're both hypotheses. They may differ. But I think the question about how does a tree help us define species goes beyond just this tree. So if you look at any tree, do you get any information about where species are if you don't know species in the first place? So if you didn't know that these groups were Homo sapiens versus bonobos versus chimpanzees, if I just showed you a tree and I said, you tell me which species, would you be able to do it? So where do I draw lines that would distinguish different species? Short answer, you can't. The phylogenetic trees don't tell us anything because you don't know what the scale of time is on this tree, for one thing. Not that time has anything to do with species definitions. So what could this tree be representing? What are the branch tips? They could be, so the nodes are common ancestors. The branch tips in this case could be species. If each of these branch tips represents one species, then you would say every branch tip is a species. What if every one of these branch tips, so in species case, that would be 1 species, 2 species, 3 species, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Same tree. Let's say we're representing something else on the branch tips.
Like a trait?
Like something bigger than species. Could be genera. So I could be representing a genus, like, for example, the big phylogeny we looked at the start, birds, mammals, frogs, turtles, etc. So that now what we're doing is representing 9 different genera on this tree. So now where the species boundaries exist. They don't. You can't even see individual species. So every branch tip represents multiple species. So no tree by itself tells us anything about where species boundaries can be drawn. It depends on what's being represented on the tree. Okay. Time for a little exercise. Of the mental variety, anyway. Please do this. So this is trying to refresh your memory about what's the most simple unit of architecture of a phylogenetic tree. So every phylogenetic tree is based on the shape you're about to draw. So what shape is that? Who are the most closely related? You don't have to take a screenshot or anything. Who are the most two closely related species up here? Okay, so how do you draw that? What letter would I draw up here if I was going to represent what shape? A V. Humans and mice. Why are they most closely related? They're mammals. So then how do we represent where tuna fits on this tree? So let's say tuna's over here. Where's the root? Right, so the root's going to be down here at the bottom. Tuna and humans and mice share a more distant common ancestor than humans and mice do. So which group is monophyletic? Humans and mice. So in this case, you've drawn a tree that represents, what are the branch tips representing? Clades, species, genera, phyla. So in this case, this is a species tree, because the labels of the branches are species. And what was the evidence that you used to create this hypothesis? Because who knows, tuna might be my great-great-great-grandfather. What piece of evidence did you use to create this tree? We already said it.
Which species is most related?
Well, so what character, what trait, what phenotype do we use to know that humans and mice are more closely related than we are to fish? So I heard we're mammals. So what's a trait that all mammals share? Hair. Okay, so that is one way to explain to somebody that's how I built this tree. I looked at all of the species that I'm representing and I asked, do you have hair, do you have hair, do you have hair? And I made all of the ones that have that, share that trait, be more closely related than the ones that don't. As far as I know, tuna do not have hair. All right. Got to get warmed up for some scientific improv. Okay, I'm going to need the audience. This is going to fail, isn't it? To name 3 different species. Any species.
Cat.
Okay, so I heard cat. What? Dolphin.
Lizard.
And lizard. Okay. So we've got cats, we've got dolphins, and we've got lizards. Which 2 are most closely related? So here are 2 different phylogenetic trees. We're going to fill out the one on the left first.
Cat and lizard.
Cat and dolphin.
Ooh, we're about to have an evolutionary rumble. So cats and dolphins are both mammals. Well, they're closely related, but dolphins have. So cat and dolphin with lizard as the outgroup. Okay. Are trees, this is not a trick question, just want to know, are trees A and B the same topology? Do they represent the same relationships between taxa, or are they different? same. They're just mirror images of each other. The shape of the tree is the same. The order of branching is the same. It's just they're mirrored. So let's say that we drew the same tree, but we rotated those two branches. In which tree, this is a trick question, in which tree are cats more closely related to lizards? Okay, so the answer should be they're the same. Cats are equally distantly related to lizards in both trees. So it doesn't matter, again, which order, left to right, the branch tips appear. So how are we to interpret these trees? Why does the order not matter? How do we declare that cats are equally distantly related to lizards in both of these trees? So the easiest way to think about, you're right, it has to do with the branching. The easiest way to think about how to interpret how related two species are is to do the following. So if I asked you how distantly related are the cat and the lizard in red, I would draw the branches I'd have to traverse to move from one extant species back in time, then move forward to the other species. And that would be a certain length, right? I could use a ruler and measure how long those two line segments are. I could measure the total length I would have to move along branches to go from one species to another. Does the total length of the branches from cat to lizard differ between these two trees? So the total length of the red lines of both of those trees is exactly the same. Right. Which means that those, regardless of how I drew the tree, cats and lizards are the same, what we'd call evolutionary distance from each other. The simpler way, maybe, of thinking about it is that both of those species have evolved from one common ancestor forward in time to the same point in time now. This is another way of saying it. If you share a common ancestor and you both exist today, that means that the cat and the lizard are one evolutionary distance diverged. What about dolphins? Are dolphins more closely or more distantly related to lizards than cats are? It's the same because exactly the same reason. If you measure the total branch lengths that separate dolphins and lizards, in blue here, they're the same on both of the trees. And it's the same if you measure the red lines and the blue lines. So cats and dolphins are exactly equally related to lizards. So measuring branch lengths is a useful way of thinking about how to answer questions such as who is more closely related to who? Cat, dolphin, lizard, who would be a good outgroup species for that group? A shark, okay. Can it be sharks with laser beams? Okay. Who is more closely related to the lizard? lizards and dolphins, or lizards and sharks? Which species are more closely related to each other? Measure branch lengths that separate the two species that I'm asking about. So who shares a more recent common ancestor? Dolphins and lizards. So they are more closely related to each other than two organisms, lizards and sharks. You have to go farther back in time before you find the node, the common ancestor that they share. I wish this app had a useful ruler where I could actually show you what the measurements of these lines are. Maybe take a screenshot and move it into a different program, or use a ruler. They don't even have a ruler on them. Measure your screen. Measure my screen. Right? The sum of the lengths of the red lines is smaller than the sum of the lengths of the blue lines. So dolphins and lizards are more closely related to each other. Again, because you go more recently back in time to find their common ancestor than lizards and sharks.
The distance between the nodes, I mean, relevant to the time scale between recent and past, the distance between the nodes seems to be equal between lizard dolphin and lizard and shark.
Right. So does the relative or does the absolute, do the relative or the absolute distances between the nodes matter? That is, I've drawn this so that all the branches are equally spaced, which certainly doesn't represent the actual flow of time through this process. So what would happen if I drew this is an extreme case. Cat, dolphin, lizard, shark. Which are more closely related? Dolphins and lizards, or dolphins and, or lizards and sharks? It's not. It's the order of nodes that's important. So as long as, so this relationship, draw it out on a piece of graph paper if you like and measure it, that is still going to be shorter than that. Because you still have to go farther back in time to find the common ancestor of lizards and sharks. So it's always going to be a longer line, regardless of how spaced the nodes are. The node that's farther back in time is always going to tell you which two species are more distantly related. Next time I'll bring a meter stick. This is an excellent question, though. So this is, I mean, these are all excellent points because it is really difficult to understand what phylogenies represent and how they're constructed and what all of these different variables mean. The x-axis, the y-axis, relative branch lengths. Kind of already gone over this point. So I'm just going to briefly tell you what it means. This is a phylogenetic tree on the left of genes. It's about 1,200 different genes from two species. So phylogenetic trees don't have to represent kingdom, phyla, class, orders, species, populations. You can get down to having every branch tip represent one gene from an organism. So you could ask, how are all the genes in you related to each other? You could build a phylogeny of genes. Who watched football over the weekend? Anybody want to cop to having watched the Super Bowl? A few of you. Okay, what sport is football most closely related to, would you think?
Rugby.
Okay, rugby. What sport is rugby most closely? What sport is related to football and rugby? American football and rugby. Soccer. Okay, so how would you draw that as a phylogenetic tree? Soccer maybe is the outgroup, with rugby and football more closely related. So you could draw a phylogeny of sports. Linguists draw phylogenies of language. How closely related are different languages to each other? So this is all to underscore the point that, especially related to the question earlier, how do you figure out where species are on a tree? Species don't necessarily even exist on a phylogenetic tree when you're talking about, for example, the one on the left, which is all genes from a single species.
Can an existing species be a common ancestor to other species?
Ooh, can an existing species be a common ancestor to other species? Right, so if it's an ancestral group, then it can't currently be alive. So the best we can do, which is one of my favorite topics, which I'm going to try not to get distracted and talk about right now, is the process of speciation. So how do different species form? That is, how do these trees branch in the first place? What happens to cause one group of organisms to become two? So the very best thing, the closest we can get to a positive answer to your question is you could look at a group of organisms at present day that are currently undergoing the speciation process. They're starting to become two distinct branches. In other words, that would be like zooming in and seeing that there's a tiny little branch shooting off there, which you can't even see because it's so small. So that's the closest we can get to one currently existing species being an ancestor. Okay. So a list of key topics from today. To get us moving into next class, I want to just do a simple exercise. We're not going to have time to do it in class. It's fine. You don't even have to do it and turn it in. Think about it. Come back to next class ready to discuss this. I want you to think, if you can remember, this is always hard for me. If you can remember this one thing and draw a phylogenetic tree, I'd be appreciative. Think about what you ate for dinner last night. I cooked it too, I can't remember. Okay, I had tortellini, Caesar salad, and some broccoli. Think of all of the ingredients that went in your dinner and draw a phylogenetic tree. How all of the organisms that you ate for dinner last night are related to each other. Okay. Draw that, sketch it out, don't turn it in, but do that exercise and come back next class when we're going to start to talk about what sorts of characteristics or traits or phenotypes we use to formulate phylogenetic trees. If you do have any remaining funds that you'd like to turn in for this wrap evolution thing, please do. Last day to collect, we're about $85 or so away from our 500. No pressure, seriously, no pressure. Don't give me money if you don't want to. And for next class, aside from that, making a phylogenetic tree of your dinner, read chapter 5.1.